August 6, 1945. Hiroshima. The morning was bright and heavy with summer heat. The sky above the city was clear, the kind of blue that promised another humid day in southern Japan. Streetcars rattled down the main avenues. Children were walking to school. Office workers crossed bridges over the quiet Ota River. On the edge of the city, a young naval engineer named Tsutomu Yamaguchi adjusted the strap of his briefcase. He was on his way to Mitsubishi's shipyard, preparing for his final day of work before returning home to Nagasaki. It was 8:15 a.m. Above him, nearly 10,000 meters higher, a silver B-29 bomber named Enola Gay cut through the sky. Inside its bomb bay, a weapon unlike any ever built rested in silence. The crew had nicknamed it Little Boy. Yamaguchi stopped for a moment in a field, noticing the strange glint of the plane high above the city. Then, a flash brighter than the sun split the morning apart. The world turned to white. In an instant, Hiroshima vanished into a storm of fire and wind. Windows liquefied. Steel bent like wax. The air itself seemed to ignite. Yamaguchi was thrown backward, the sky collapsing into thunder. When he awoke, the horizon burned orange. His eardrums were ruptured, his body seared, and the city he had stood in moments ago was gone, reduced to a single column of smoke rising into eternity. He had just survived humanity's first atomic bomb, and in 4 days, he would face another. The story of Tsutomu Yamaguchi cannot be told without understanding the world he lived in. That August, a nation unraveling, a war already lost in everything but name. By the summer of 1945, Japan was a shadow of its former empire. Its navy lay at the bottom of the Pacific. Its cities were ash, its people, weary and starving, endured nightly bombings that turned streets into rivers of flame. For nearly 4 years, the war in the Pacific had been fought with a brutality few could imagine. From the jungles of Burma to the volcanic plains of Iwo Jima, Japan's soldiers had fought until the last man. Yet by mid-1945, defeat loomed inevitable. Allied submarines strangled its shipping routes. Oil reserves had all but vanished. Tokyo had been reduced to cinders in March. When American B-29 bombers dropped hundreds of thousands of incendiary bombs that killed over 100,000 people in a single night. Still, the military government refused surrender. Inside the imperial palace, ministers debated peace, but the word itself was dangerous. The emperor's voice remained silent. The Supreme War Council clung to the idea of fighting on, hoping that one last, decisive battle could force a negotiated end. Japan's military code demanded death before dishonor. To surrender was unthinkable. Across the Pacific, however, another kind of calculation was taking place. The United States had spent more than $2 billion developing a weapon that promised to end the war without an invasion. The Manhattan Project had combined the brightest scientific minds from across the Allied world, from Oppenheimer and Fermi to military engineers working in secrecy at Los Alamos, Hanford, and Oak Ridge. After 3 years of relentless work, the weapon was ready. The first atomic test, Trinity, had been detonated in the New Mexico desert just 3 weeks earlier. President Harry Truman, newly in office after Roosevelt's death, was briefed on the bomb's power in stark terms. The invasion of Japan, codenamed Operation Downfall, was expected to cost up to 1 million Allied casualties, and many times that number in Japanese lives. Hiroshima, a city of military industry and command centers, was chosen as the first target. Nagasaki was on the list as well, a backup should weather obscure other sites. On August 6th, the bomber group led by Colonel Paul Tibbets took off from Tinian Island at 2:45 a.m. The crew carried with them a weapon that had never been used in combat. As dawn broke over the inland sea of Japan, Hiroshima's sirens wailed briefly. A single aircraft detected, then dismissed as harmless. In that moment, on the ground, Tsutomu Yamaguchi was thinking only of his family. He had been in Hiroshima for 3 months, helping design an oil tanker for Mitsubishi Heavy Industries. That morning, he was anxious to return home. His wife, Hisako, and their infant son waited for him in Nagasaki. His work was done. He was ready to leave. But at 8:15, the world he knew ended. The bomb exploded 600 meters above the city center, releasing energy equivalent to 16,000 tons of TNT. A blinding flash, a heat wave hotter than the surface of the sun. In less than a second, everything within 2 kilometers was obliterated. Tens of thousands died instantly. Others would perish in the hours, days, and weeks that followed. From burns, collapse, or the strange invisible sickness that no one yet understood. Yamaguchi, standing nearly 3 kilometers from the blast, survived by a margin that defied all logic. His face and arms were burned. His hearing was gone. His clothes hung in tatters. The city around him was silent but for the cries of the wounded. Through the smoke, he staggered toward the ruins of the shipyard, searching for his colleagues. The Ota River ran black with debris and bodies. Flames climbed what was left of buildings. He would later describe the light as a magnesium flare that consumed the whole world. He found 2 co-workers alive, barely. Together, they spent the night in a half-collapsed air raid shelter on the edge of the destroyed city, breathing through wet rags as the sky rained ash. The next morning, Yamaguchi made a decision. Burned, half-deaf, and covered in bandages, he would try to return home to Nagasaki. By dawn on August 7th, he began walking toward the railway through fields of glass and twisted metal. He reached the station, still somehow operational amid the ruins. There, among hundreds of survivors trying to flee, he boarded a train that would take him back into history. He did not yet know that he was traveling from one nuclear ground zero to another. The train that carried Tsutomu Yamaguchi out of Hiroshima was a miracle in itself. Its windows were gone, its cars scarred with heat. But it still moved, crawling through the scorched landscape, past forests stripped bare and rivers that shimmered with ash. Survivors sat in silence, their bodies wrapped in burns, their eyes hollow and distant. None of them spoke. The countryside beyond looked untouched, peaceful even, as if the apocalypse behind them had been a dream. After hours of travel, Yamaguchi reached Nagasaki on the evening of August 7th. The city was calm, ordinary in the way that Hiroshima had been 2 days earlier. Hisako, his wife, was waiting for him. When she saw the burns across his face and arms, she gasped. He told her, haltingly, hoarsely, that Hiroshima had been destroyed by a single bomb. She couldn't comprehend it. No one could. At the Mitsubishi Hospital in Nagasaki, doctors treated his burns with ointment and bandages. Radiation sickness had not yet been identified. His symptoms were mistaken for heat exposure and shock. Yamaguchi's wounds blistered and cracked, but he was alive. Against all odds, he reported back to work on August 9th. It was his duty, he said. That morning, clouds hung low over Nagasaki. The air smelled faintly of the sea. The city was built in a narrow valley, surrounded by hills that had spared it from most previous bombings. People felt safer here. School children practiced evacuation drills. Workers went about their routines. At Mitsubishi's office, Yamaguchi stood before his supervisor, trying to explain what he had seen. He told them about the blinding flash, the explosion that had erased a city in seconds. His superior shook his head. "One bomb can't do that," he said. Yamaguchi began to argue, to describe the fire, the wind, the light. Then, at 11:02 a.m., another flash filled the room. The second atomic bomb, Fat Man, detonated over the Urakami Valley just 3 kilometers away. The blast wave shattered the building. The walls folded inward. Glass and paper filled the air. Yamaguchi was thrown to the ground once again, the same searing heat burning his body a second time. He crawled from the wreckage in disbelief. Outside, Nagasaki was burning. The cathedral at Urakami was gone. The valley had become a basin of smoke and flame. He searched for his wife and child, heart pounding, fearing the worst. When he reached his neighborhood, he found the house flattened. But Hisako and their son had survived. By an impossible twist of fate, she had taken shelter in a tunnel moments before the blast. The shock wave had torn through the area, but the tunnel's stone walls held. Once again, the Yamaguchis were alive amid annihilation. In the days that followed, black rain fell on Nagasaki. Thick, radioactive, bitter. Thousands wandered through the ruins, burned and blinded. The hospitals overflowed with the dying. Doctors watched patients' hair fall out, their wounds refusing to heal, their fevers climbing until death. None of them understood what was happening. They called it atom bomb disease. By August 10th, Japan's leadership knew the truth. 2 cities had been erased by weapons of incomprehensible power. Hiroshima was gone. Nagasaki was gone. Communications broke down. Survivors spoke of men melting into walls, of shadows burned into the ground. The emperor's advisors argued through the night. The war had become meaningless. In Tokyo, Emperor Hirohito broke centuries of imperial silence. He told his ministers that the war must end. On August 15th, his voice was broadcast to the nation for the first time in history. The words were careful, restrained, but unmistakable. Japan would surrender. Tsutomu Yamaguchi listened to that radio broadcast in what was left of his home. His skin was bandaged. His city was quiet. He had survived 2 sons. He would live to tell the world what it meant to see the end of everything. Twice. When history remembers atomic warfare, it often does so through numbers, kilotons, casualties, distances from the hypocenter. But the story of Tsutomu Yamaguchi reveals another dimension of that moment. The human scale. Through him, the incomprehensible becomes intimate. To understand his survival is to examine not only the physics of destruction, but the endurance of one man caught twice in its heart. The first angle is human survival against physical annihilation. At Hiroshima, Yamaguchi's burns covered 1/3 of his body. His hearing was gone. His face was swollen and raw. The flash had seared his skin where his clothes did not cover him, a brand of light that never faded. And yet, he walked. Scientists later calculated that anyone standing within 2 kilometers of ground zero should have died instantly. Yamaguchi was 2.8 kilometers away, close enough to be hurled to the ground, but just far enough for a fragment of life to remain. He spent that night among the wounded, sharing canteens of polluted water. Radiation sickness came in waves, nausea, bleeding, fever. But somehow his organs held. In medical terms, his survival bordered on the impossible. Yet it was not just his body that endured. His mind clung to coherence amid horror. In later interviews, Yamaguchi described not heroism, but confusion, a disbelief so deep it numbed the pain. "I thought," he said, "the sun had exploded." He could not imagine human hands had done this. That disbelief may have saved him. Panic kills, focus preserves. In the middle of ash and fire, he found direction. home. That singular thought pulled him out of Hiroshima's inferno and onto the train that carried him unknowingly toward Nagasaki. The second angle is the moral paradox of technology. The same engineering precision that Yamaguchi practiced in his work had, in another world, designed the bomb that nearly killed him. He was a draftsman, a man who turned lines on paper into ships of steel. His job existed because Japan needed oil, and oil meant war. In both Hiroshima and Nagasaki, Mitsubishi factories built weapons, engines, and ships that fueled the empire's conflict. The Americans saw these cities as industrial targets, legitimate military objectives. The bomb was, by military logic, a strategic strike meant to end the war. But standing in the ruins, Yamaguchi realized that logic failed to account for the human cost. The blast had erased not soldiers, but civilians. Mothers, students, old men, infants. For decades after, he questioned the morality of progress without conscience. The same brilliance that could create also destroyed. This contradiction became his lifelong obsession: how science could be both humanity's triumph and its curse. The third angle lies in the silence of survivors. For years after 1945, Hibakusha, atomic bomb survivors, were treated with suspicion, even avoidance, within Japan. Many believed radiation sickness was contagious. Survivors found it hard to find work or spouses. Governments censored early reports. Medical data was controlled by American occupation authorities. Yamaguchi, like thousands of others, lived quietly with his scars. He seldom spoke of what he had seen. His burns healed, his hearing partially returned, and he resumed work as an engineer. On the surface, he was an ordinary man. But inside, the memories lived on. He dreamed of blinding light, of shadows burned into walls. When he closed his eyes, he saw Hiroshima's sky, white, endless, and screaming. The trauma ran deeper than medicine could reach. And still, he survived. He married, raised children, and rebuilt his life in Nagasaki. In that endurance was a quiet defiance, the refusal to let death define him. The fourth angle is the rare intersection of fate and probability. To survive one atomic blast was extraordinary. To survive two, separated by 300 kilometers and 3 days, bordered on cosmic improbability. Historians have compared the odds to being struck by lightning, not once, but twice on consecutive days, and living to tell the tale. For decades, people doubted Yamaguchi's story. It sounded impossible. Only in 2009 did Japan's government officially recognize him as a double survivor, a Niju Hibakusha. He was 93 years old. His survival challenges our understanding of chance and purpose. Was it luck, coincidence, or a cruel symmetry of history, binding one man to both epicenters of destruction? Yamaguchi himself rejected the idea of divine protection. "I might have died in either city," he once said, "but I was spared, perhaps to bear witness." The fifth angle emerges from his later transformation into a voice for peace. For most of his life, Yamaguchi remained silent. Then, after decades of reflection, he began to speak publicly about nuclear war. The Cold War had revived the same fears he had once lived through, the threat of annihilation hanging over humanity. In his 70s and 80s, he gave interviews, lectures, and testimonies. His message was simple: no man should ever experience what I have seen twice. He met with students, scientists, and even United Nations officials. His story transcended nationality. He did not blame America or Japan. He blamed the idea that any nation could wield such power without consequence. His calm, soft-spoken testimony reached further than political rhetoric ever could. It was not anger, but sorrow that made people listen. And within that sorrow, one truth remained. He was alive when hundreds of thousands were not. That guilt, that sense of having walked out of two infernos untouched by death, would haunt him forever. Yet it also gave his words the quiet gravity of experience. Each of these angles, survival, technology, silence, fate, and peace, orbit around the same unanswerable question. Why him? Why twice? And that question leads us deeper into the moment that defined his second survival. The instant when the world's most destructive power struck again over the skies of Nagasaki. The sixth angle is the scientific and medical enigma of radiation's effects on the human body. In 1945, no physician in Japan, or anywhere, understood what radiation truly did to living tissue. The atomic bomb had introduced a new form of injury, invisible and continuous. Yamaguchi's body became a case study in endurance, beyond what doctors believed possible. His burns healed unevenly, the skin on his left arm and face remaining mottled for life. For months, his hair fell out in clumps, his gums bled, and his wounds reopened without cause. But somehow, his internal organs recovered. Later research showed that distance, shielding, and individual physiology all played crucial roles in survival. Yamaguchi's first exposure at Hiroshima had been from a ground distance where the radiation dose, though severe, was not instantly fatal. His body had already suffered trauma. It should have weakened him. Yet, when Nagasaki's blast wave struck, he was inside an office reinforced with concrete, which absorbed much of the initial radiation and heat. Luck, structure, and perhaps genetic resilience combined to preserve him. Scientists who studied his case decades later found no clear explanation. He had been irradiated twice, one researcher wrote, and yet lived long enough to see a world that had learned to fear the atom. The seventh angle reveals the cultural and psychological burden of survival in post-war Japan. In a society that valued collective endurance over individual suffering, survivors were often expected to move on quietly. Talking about the bomb invited pity, or worse, alienation. Some employers refused to hire Hibakusha, fearing illness or contagion. Yamaguchi's decision to continue his engineering work reflected this societal pressure to normalize the unimaginable. He worked, smiled, and contributed as though the firestorms behind him were chapters already closed. But the memories persisted. In private, Yamaguchi wrote poetry and sketches describing the two blasts. He often used the word pika, the Japanese onomatopoeia for flash, followed by dan, the deep rumble that followed seconds later. Those two sounds, he wrote, had split his life in half. He lived in a world that had already ended twice. Every thunderclap reminded him of the sky tearing apart. Yet he carried those memories with quiet dignity, embodying Japan's national transformation from militarism to reflection. The eighth angle examines the shifting moral lens through which the atomic bombings have been viewed. To the Allied world in 1945, Hiroshima and Nagasaki represented a brutal but necessary end to a brutal war. To Japan, they became symbols of loss, tragedy, and renewal. Yamaguchi stood at the crossroads of those perspectives. He neither condemned nor forgave. He understood the desperation that had led to the bomb's use. But he also understood that its victims were ordinary people, not symbols. In the decades that followed, debates raged over whether the bombings were justified. Military historians cited the invasion casualties avoided. Ethicists argued that the attacks introduced a terror that forever changed human warfare. Yamaguchi watched these arguments unfold with the detachment of one who had seen beyond them. He often said that morality becomes meaningless when cities are vaporized in seconds. The bomb, he once remarked, does not distinguish between right and wrong. The ninth angle focuses on the global echo of his testimony in the nuclear age. By the 1950s and 1960s, the world lived under the shadow of mutually assured destruction. Nations built arsenals thousands of times more powerful than the bombs dropped on Japan. In this climate, Yamaguchi's survival became a living warning. When his story reached international audiences in the 2000s, it resonated not as a relic of the past, but as a mirror of the present. He spoke softly, often seated, his voice trembling with age. He told his listeners that the second bomb had convinced him of one thing: human beings cannot control what they create. He met survivors of other nuclear tragedies: Chernobyl, Bikini Atoll, and later Fukushima, each recognizing in him a quiet kinship. His message bridged generations, that knowledge without wisdom leads to extinction. He believed that remembering was not enough. Only empathy could prevent repetition. And finally, the 10th angle is the symbolic legacy of the double hibakusha. In the world's collective memory, Tsutomu Yamaguchi became more than a survivor. He became a symbol of endurance, contradiction, and fragile hope. His life stood as proof that even amid humanity's darkest invention, life could persist. Yet he never sought fame. When journalists called him the luckiest man alive, he disagreed. "I am not lucky," he said quietly. "Luck is being born in a world without nuclear weapons." When he died in 2010 at the age of 93, Japan's newspapers printed his story beside photographs of mushroom clouds, those haunting symbols that had followed him all his life. He was the only officially recognized man to have survived both atomic bombings. But he represented thousands more whose names were lost. His ashes were placed beside his wife's in Nagasaki, in sight of the valley that had once been a sea of fire. In the intersection of coincidence, endurance, and moral reckoning, Yamaguchi's story draws us closer to the day when humanity first glimpsed its own power to end itself. And that moment, the culmination of science, war, and fate, found its most terrifying clarity not in a laboratory or a palace, but in the burning sky above Hiroshima and Nagasaki. That sky would now open once more as we reach the turning point of the story, the precise moment when survival met history, and the world stepped into the nuclear age. August 9th, 1945. Nagasaki, Japan. The hour before the second blast. The city still breathed the uneasy calm of a nation awaiting collapse. B-29 bombers had been spotted on radar earlier that morning, but air raid sirens were common, and most citizens ignored them. A light drizzle fell over the hills surrounding the Urakami Valley. Inside a reinforced office of Mitsubishi's shipbuilding department, Tsutomu Yamaguchi stood at a drafting table, still bandaged from his burns, still trying to explain what had happened in Hiroshima 3 days earlier. At 10:30 a.m., the American bomber Boxcar, piloted by Major Charles Sweeney, was approaching the coast of Kyushu. It carried a single bomb, a plutonium implosion device codenamed Fat Man. It was more complex and powerful than the uranium bomb dropped on Hiroshima. The target was originally Kokura, an industrial city north of Nagasaki. But dense clouds and smoke from previous bombings obscured the view. After 3 failed passes over Kokura, the crew diverted to their secondary target, Nagasaki. At 10:58, the aircraft arrived over the city. Sweeney had only enough fuel for 1 bombing run. He circled once, found a break in the clouds, and at 11:02 released the weapon. The bomb fell for 43 seconds. When it detonated, 500 meters above the Urakami Valley, The explosion was even more devastating than Hiroshima's. A sphere of fire nearly 2 kilometers wide consumed the valley in an instant. Temperatures at the center reached 4,000 degrees Celsius. The shockwave flattened everything within a radius of 3 kilometers: homes, hospitals, churches, and schools. The blast was so powerful, it vaporized the water in the nearby river and sent a column of smoke 15 kilometers into the air. Inside the Mitsubishi office, Yamaguchi barely had time to shout a warning. The window burst inward, the room filled with a light too bright to comprehend. He threw himself to the floor as walls collapsed around him. Debris and glass rained down, cutting into his already burned skin. For a moment, there was silence. Then came the roar, the rolling thunder of air torn apart. When the dust settled, he opened his eyes to a world he already knew. The same orange haze, the same silence broken only by distant cries. He stumbled outside, half blind, and saw Nagasaki in flames. The hills that had once protected the city now trapped the heat, turning the valley into a furnace. The cathedral at Urakami, the largest Christian church in Asia, was gone, reduced to rubble and ash. Thousands of worshippers who had gathered for confession that morning were simply erased. He began walking, each step measured, each breath a reminder that the air itself was poison. He thought only of his wife and child. Izuku and their son had been at home, nearly 3 kilometers from the hypocenter. He followed the trail through collapsing streets, past people whose skin hung from their arms, whose faces were masks of soot and agony. Many begged for water. He had none to give. When he reached his neighborhood, he found the remains of his house smoldering, the roof caved in. But from the darkness of a nearby shelter, he heard his wife's voice. She had taken their son to a water storage tunnel moments before the blast, an act of instinct that saved them both. When she saw him again, burned a second time, she wept. They embraced, wordless, surrounded by ruins. Elsewhere in the city, the scale of destruction defied comprehension. The Urakami district, home to Nagasaki's Catholic community, was annihilated. The Shiroyama area burned for hours. The Nagasaki Medical College, located less than a kilometer from Ground Zero, was obliterated. Doctors and patients alike vanished. Estimates suggest that within seconds, 35,000 people were dead. By the end of the year, the toll would rise beyond 70,000. The blast radius had been partially contained by the surrounding hills, sparing parts of the city center. But within the valley, there was no survival. Survivors later described the smell of burning flesh, the moans that filled the night, and the black rain that fell in the evening, thick with ash, soot, and radioactive particles. It stained the skin and poisoned the wells. Yamaguchi, Hisako, and their child spent that night in a nearby shelter. His wounds reopened. Fever set in. Hisako's skin blistered where radiation had touched it. Around them, people died quietly in the dark. When dawn broke, the valley was gray. No birds, no wind. Only the smoldering remains of what had been Nagasaki. For the second time in 4 days, Yamaguchi had witnessed a city's destruction from its center. He did not yet know that the war was already ending, that the decision to surrender had been made in Tokyo while Nagasaki still burned. The man who had lived through both atomic infernos now lay between life and death, unaware that his story had just become one of history's most improbable testaments to survival. By the morning of August 10th, Nagasaki was a graveyard of ash. Smoke still drifted over the valley, curling around the shattered hills. The fires had finally begun to die, but the city no longer had a center, only silence. For those who survived the blast, the days that followed were worse than the explosion itself. Tsutomu Yamaguchi woke in the dim light of the shelter, his body trembling. His wounds from Hiroshima were now mixed with new burns, the pain layered like memory. The air was thick with the smell of charred wood and decay. When he stepped outside, the street he had walked countless times no longer existed. The trees were gone. The stone walls had melted into glass. Bodies lay where the blast had thrown them. Some crouched in prayer, others turned to shadows on the pavement. He and Hitsako searched for food and water, scavenging among the ruins. The wells were contaminated. The river ran black. They boiled what little they could find, unaware that the radiation had already entered their bodies. Hisako's hair began to fall out within days. Their infant son developed a rash that refused to heal. Yet, against all odds, they lived on. In the heart of the city, American reconnaissance aircraft circled, photographing the destruction. The mushroom cloud had already been reported back to Washington. On the same day, President Truman addressed the world, confirming the use of the second atomic bomb. "If they do not now accept our terms," he warned, "they may expect a rain of ruin from the air, the likes of which has never been seen on this earth." But there was no longer any Japan left to bomb. The country was broken, its cities erased, its armies starving, its emperor trapped between pride and extinction. On August 9th, while Nagasaki burned, the Soviet Union declared war on Japan, invading Manchuria and crushing the last remnants of the Kwantung Army. The empire's hope of negotiating peace through Moscow evaporated overnight. Inside the imperial palace, the shock was complete. Ministers argued for hours. Some demanded one last battle to preserve honor. Others knew the end had come. The army minister, General Anami, vowed to fight on, while Foreign Minister Togo pleaded for surrender. As the night wore on, the council reached an impasse. Then, for the first time in Japan's modern history, Emperor Hirohito intervened personally. "We must endure the unendurable," he said. "We must suffer what is insufferable." In Nagasaki, no one yet knew of this decision. Yamaguchi's neighborhood lay in ruins. Makeshift clinics were set up in surviving schools where doctors worked without instruments or medicine. The wounded lay in rows on straw mats, many too burned to speak. Radiation sickness began to reveal its horror. Vomiting, fever, bleeding gums, delirium. The term Genbaku Sho, atomic bomb illness, entered the Japanese vocabulary. Yamaguchi was brought to a field hospital where his burns were redressed. A doctor, seeing the symmetry of his injuries, asked how he had been burned twice. When Yamaguchi told him he had come from Hiroshima, the man stared in disbelief. It sounded impossible. 2 atomic bombs, 1 man. He simply nodded and moved on to the next patient. There were too many to treat. By August 12th, heavy rain fell again. Black rain. It coated the rubble in a slick, oily film, and survivors licked it from leaves in desperation. The radio stations were silent. Power lines were gone. Only rumor moved faster than truth. Some said Tokyo had been destroyed. Others whispered that the Americans had hundreds more bombs ready. Then, on August 15th, a voice spoke through the static of the radio, the Emperor himself. No one had ever heard him speak before. His tone was formal, distant, yet trembling with exhaustion. He did not use the word surrender. Instead, he spoke of accepting the terms of the Allies. But everyone understood. The war was over. In that moment, Yamaguchi wept, not from relief, but from the enormity of it. He thought of Hiroshima, of Nagasaki, of the cities that no longer existed. He thought of the friends he had lost, of the colleagues vaporized in the shipyard. He thought of the light that had twice consumed his world. His tears burned the raw skin of his face. He had witnessed the end of the war, and the beginning of a new kind of fear. For humanity had discovered the power to destroy itself, and he had walked through its aftermath twice. As the surrender broadcasts spread across Japan, the surviving population emerged from bunkers and shelters to a landscape beyond comprehension. Hiroshima and Nagasaki became laboratories of both science and sorrow. American occupation forces arrived within weeks, collecting samples, photographing the ruins, and interviewing survivors. Yamaguchi, bandaged and frail, was among them. He was one of the few who could describe both bombings firsthand. Yet when asked how he had lived through them, he had no answer. He only said, "I was lucky to be where death stopped." That luck would define the rest of his life. But before it became legend, it was simply survival, the instinct to move forward when the world itself had ended. The flames of Nagasaki would cool, but the questions born in that heat would not. What had humanity unleashed? Could such a weapon ever be justified? And what happens to a man who sees the apocalypse twice and must find a way to live in its shadow? Those questions would shape the long, haunted aftermath that followed. In the months following the bombings, Japan's cities were a landscape of ruin and mourning. Hiroshima and Nagasaki were not just destroyed, they were erased. Photographs taken by the Americans and later released to the Japanese public revealed streets reduced to ash. Buildings flattened, shadows burned into concrete as permanent evidence of the inferno. Tens of thousands of bodies had been vaporized, others left unrecognizable by heat. While survivors roamed the ruins, their faces etched with shock and burns that would not heal for decades. Tsutomu Yamaguchi returned to Nagasaki with his family, carrying the physical and psychological weight of having survived not once, but twice. For ordinary citizens, life after the bombings was a slow negotiation with scarcity and trauma. Food was rationed, clean water was scarce. Many homes were destroyed or uninhabitable. The psychological toll was immense. Survivors faced recurring nightmares, survivor guilt, and the haunting knowledge of those who had died while they lived. For Yamaguchi, every step outside the ruins reminded him of the first blast in Hiroshima and the second in Nagasaki. Medical response in both cities was overwhelmed. Doctors and nurses improvised in schools, temples, and public halls, treating burns, radiation sickness, and trauma. Those who survived the initial blasts often died later from infections or organ failure. The term hibakusha, atomic bomb survivor, became widely used, identifying a population forever marked by radiation exposure. Statistics reveal that by the end of 1945, Hiroshima had lost an estimated 140,000 people, and Nagasaki around 70,000. Thousands more would die in subsequent years from radiation-related illnesses. International reaction to the bombings was mixed, though increasingly divided along political lines. In the United States, the attacks were justified as a necessary measure to end the war quickly and save lives that an invasion would have cost. In Japan, the narrative was one of horror, devastation, and collective grief. Families mourned those lost, cities mourned their own destruction, and survivors like Yamaguchi carried a personal burden that could not be quantified. Yamaguchi himself began documenting his experience quietly, keeping records of dates, locations, and injuries. Unlike many survivors, he had witnessed both bombings firsthand, making his account singular in historical record. His testimony was invaluable to scientists, historians, and later humanitarian organizations seeking to understand the effects of atomic warfare on human life. Yet for decades, he did not speak publicly. Partly out of modesty, partly out of a desire to live normally amid a nation rebuilding itself from ruin. The occupation of Japan by Allied forces brought both order and tension. Cities were reconstructed in haste, often ignoring the long-term health needs of survivors. Yamaguchi and other hibakusha faced stigma due to radiation sickness symptoms, sometimes being ostracized or denied employment. Yet, even amid social and economic challenges, the survivors' resilience became a foundation for Japan's post-war recovery. Families rebuilt, communities formed, and a culture of remembrance slowly emerged to honor those lost and to acknowledge the unique suffering of atomic bomb survivors. Yamaguchi's personal aftermath extended beyond physical survival. His burns faded with time, but the mental scars remained. He reflected on the extraordinary improbability of his survival, the randomness that spared him while so many perished. He carried survivor guilt silently, recognizing that he owed his life to chance, preparation, and a stubborn instinct to move forward. The experience imbued him with a moral responsibility to bear witness to the consequences of nuclear warfare, to ensure the world would remember the human cost of weapons that could erase entire cities in seconds. From a historical perspective, the dual bombings reshaped military strategy and international relations. The unprecedented destruction demonstrated the decisive power of nuclear weapons, forcing Japan's surrender and ushering in the atomic age. Leaders worldwide took note, realizing that future conflicts carried the potential for unprecedented devastation. For civilians and survivors, however, the bombings became a cautionary tale, a reminder that technological advancement without ethical restraint could annihilate ordinary life in an instant. The experience of Yamaguchi and other hibakusha also influenced Japan's post-war pacifism. Constitutions and policies were shaped by the collective trauma of nuclear devastation. Cities were rebuilt with memorials and museums dedicated to educating future generations. Memorial ceremonies, held annually on August 6th and 9th, reinforced a national consciousness of peace and remembrance. Yamaguchi's quiet testimony contributed to this cultural memory, framing the atomic bomb not merely as a military event, but as a human tragedy that demanded reflection. Through all this, he maintained a humble existence in Nagasaki, blending into a city that had survived its own erasure. While the world debated politics and strategy, Yamaguchi lived the reality. Scars both visible and invisible, the knowledge that death had passed him by twice, and the profound awareness that every moment of life thereafter was improbable and fragile. In the years following the war, Tsutomu Yamaguchi's survival became both a personal burden and a historical beacon. He returned to Mitsubishi as an engineer, resuming work on ship designs and industrial projects, quietly integrating into a society focused on rebuilding. Despite the physical pain lingering from 2 atomic blasts, he lived a life defined by routine and responsibility, caring for his family and contributing to Nagasaki's reconstruction. Yet beneath the surface, the psychological weight of what he had endured remained profound. The hibakusha community, once silent and marginalized, slowly became more vocal. Yamaguchi watched as survivors began to organize, to demand recognition and health care, and to share stories of the nuclear attacks. Their testimonies exposed the reality behind the bombings, the human suffering that statistics could never capture. For Yamaguchi, the challenge was not just physical survival, but translating his experience into a voice for those who could no longer speak. By the 1960s and 1970s, Japan's economic recovery had transformed cities once again into centers of industry and culture. Nagasaki, scarred by the Fat Man, rose from the ashes, modernized and thriving. Memorials to victims were erected, but the scale of human loss remained staggering. Yamaguchi often visited the monuments quietly, reflecting on the thousands whose lives had ended where he had survived. He would sometimes lay flowers at sites where friends and colleagues had perished, acknowledging the randomness that had spared him while they were lost. Medical studies of atomic bomb survivors began to expand in scope during this period. Researchers documented long-term radiation effects, including leukemia, cataracts, and cancer. Yamaguchi's own health fluctuated. Though he survived, he carried chronic illnesses linked to radiation exposure. Nevertheless, he continued to participate in studies, his experience providing invaluable data that would inform nuclear safety and humanitarian understanding for generations. International recognition of his unique survival came slowly. The Japanese government officially acknowledged him as a double hibakusha in 2009, making him the only person recognized to have survived both Hiroshima and Nagasaki. By that time, Yamaguchi had become a symbol not of luck alone, but of human endurance, moral clarity, and the imperative to remember the horrors of nuclear warfare. Media and historians called him the man who lived through history twice, but he often rejected the label of hero. He insisted that his survival was not extraordinary in courage or choice, but sheer chance. Beyond recognition, Yamaguchi's story became a tool for education and advocacy. He spoke to students, diplomats, and peace organizations, emphasizing the fragility of human life in the nuclear age. His lectures were marked by calm reflection rather than anger, detailing the horrors of fire, radiation, and human loss, and insisting on the moral responsibility to prevent future nuclear catastrophes. "I did not want to die twice," he said, "and I do not want anyone else to experience what I did." Yamaguchi's later years were also defined by a quiet family life, a testament to resilience. He married Hisako, survived with his child, and watched grandchildren grow up in a Japan vastly different from the one he had known in 1945. Every year, he attended memorial ceremonies for the victims of both bombings, offering prayers not only for the dead, but for those who survived with their own unseen scars. When he passed away in 2010 at the age of 93, tributes poured in from around the world. Newspapers recounted his extraordinary survival. Scientists cited his first-hand experiences, and peace organizations honored his advocacy. Yet even in global recognition, Yamaguchi remained steadfastly humble, insisting that he was merely one among thousands of victims and survivors, a living witness to history's most destructive human invention. His life embodies the intersection of survival, memory, and moral responsibility. He survived twice the worst humanity could inflict, bore the consequences of history, and emerged with a message that transcended nationality or politics. A warning, a reflection, and a testament to human endurance in the face of unimaginable destruction. Tsutomu Yamaguchi's life forces us to confront the fragile boundary between survival and annihilation. 2 cities reduced to ash in days, 2 blasts, and yet 1 man remained. He was neither invincible nor chosen. He was a witness. His scars, both visible and hidden, became a record of what happens when human ambition and technological power exceed moral restraint. In his quiet endurance, Yamaguchi embodied a paradox: life persisting where the world had sought to erase it. Every day after August 1945 was an act of defiance against the fire that had consumed Hiroshima and Nagasaki. To live after witnessing total destruction was to carry a responsibility heavier than any uniform or medal could confer. He did not seek glory. He sought understanding. His survival also reminds us that history is experienced not only through decisions of leaders or strategies of war, but through the lives of ordinary people. The engineer, the wife, the child. They are as central to the story as presidents and generals. Yamaguchi's testimony gives humanity a lens through which to measure the cost of technological power, the weight of probability, and the moral consequences of unleashing forces we cannot control. In the decades that followed, his calm advocacy for peace and nuclear disarmament became a moral compass. He spoke not in anger, but in measured clarity, urging the world to remember the human faces behind the mushroom clouds. His words bridged generations, from survivors of war to citizens living under the shadow of modern nuclear arsenals. The lesson he carried was simple, yet profound. Survival is not just living. It is remembering, bearing witness, and striving to prevent repetition of such destruction. When he passed in 2010, the world recognized him not only as the only man to survive both atomic bombings, but as a symbol of endurance, reflection, and the delicate value of life. The twin flashes of Hiroshima and Nagasaki became more than historical events. Through Yamaguchi, they became human experiences, tragedies and warnings etched into memory. In the end, Tsutomu Yamaguchi teaches us that even in the face of unimaginable destruction, life can persist, and with it, the chance to bear witness, to understand, and to hope. His story is a quiet, lasting reminder that history is measured not only in bombs and casualties, but in the fragile, improbable resilience of the human spirit.